via, togliamo la trascrizione. Okay. So, welcome to the third seminar of the Sport International Politics in Europe. Today, as a guest, we have Francesca Iurlaro. Francesca Iurlaro, she's a visiting fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Comparative and Private International Law. So we will have today a different approach from the one that offers Lorenzo Venuti, that is more an historian, or the one that offers us Nicola De Martini, that is more a sociologist slash anthropologist. With Francesca, we will focus always on topics on international politics, but with the focus of the international law, the approach of the international law. And I'm really glad to give her the floor, because when I met her in a football conference early in the year, we discussed a little bit, and her focus is Georgia. And as you know, Georgia in this period, while from a Western perspective, an Italian perspective, can be a peripheral country, is becoming now a very important country for what's happening at geopolitical level. And let's not forget, when we discussed about the violation of the Olympic truce, that one of the first violations of the Olympic truce made by Putin Russia was in 2008 with the war that creating somehow the independent republics of Abkhazia and South Ossetia that we discuss about, also speaking about the BRICS game. But I don't want to leave any time to our guest, and I'm very curious about today's topics, to learn something about football, law, and politics in Georgia. So Francesca, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Nicola, for the invite. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we hear you very well.
And
yes.
So you see the presentation too, yes?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. So thank you so much for the invite. I'm really glad to be here with you today. I unfortunately don't see you, but I'm happy you see me and the screen. I just wanted, Nicola, did you say something?
No, I show you. I don't know if. All right, wait. Go. You can go. I put the camera in a way that you can see all the students. Okay, yeah.
Let's see, because I do want to.
No,
just that now I'm stuck with the PowerPoint, but maybe I can find a way to see both the screen and you. Okay, good. Let's see. Because you see the PowerPoint, no?
Yeah, perfectly. Yeah.
Okay. I was just being a bit ambitious. I wanted to see the screen and the room. But
this is too much, is impossible.
I think it's too much. Yeah, okay. So something's got to give. All right. But I see you. So hello, and I'll start my presentation. So I just wanted to apologize because I have a bit of a cold. So I might need to stop at some point just to get some water or just some whatever remedies Germany has to offer. So basically, yes, as Nicola said, we will be talking about the case of Georgia today, and what has happened basically over this year, which has been a very interesting year, but also quite fraught with so many difficulties for this country that probably I think many of us in Europe have not heard about before. But there are reasons for that, and now we do, because there's so much going on, and we will talk about this today. So when I said that, Nicola also said it, Georgia is also sometimes people think it's Georgia in the US, so there's always a bit of a confusion. But when we talk about Georgia, the question is always, is Georgia in Europe or in Asia? So here you have a Reddit quote, as you can see, a very authoritative source. But so basically, just Googling, you can see that this is a very shared confusion that people have about Georgia. And the confusion is well placed, because Georgia is in the Caucasus, so it's Central Asia. But historically, its ties to Europe are very close. Just one example I can make is that, for example, Greek mythology, most of it, like some important episodes of Greek mythology, such as the Argonauts, are connected to Georgia, which was called, in antiquity, it was called Kolkis. So, for example, the famous golden fleece that Jason seeks to retrieve with the Argonauts is actually to be found in Kolkis. So, the so-called peripheral position of Georgia is actually not that peripheral at all, but it is a frontier position, let's just say, because clearly, in terms of like political influences and political history, Georgia is in Central Asia. It was also part of the USSR. It became an independent nation in 1991. But as I said, the historical ties to Europe are way closer than we think. But it's just part of, I think, the imagination about Georgia has to be somehow, we have to talk about this and sort of retrace what possible histories are there to be told about Georgia. But anyway, so here's a map, so you can have a sense of whether it's in Europe or in Asia, but this is just to give you an idea where this is. And of course, Russia is, I would say, dangerously close. And I'm happy that you talked about Russia already in other classes. So I know that you're already caught up on the context. So let's just begin. As I said, it has been a very important year for Georgia. A lot of things have happened politically, and also regarding football, and also the interaction, of course, between football and politics. So let's just go like I mean, this first part will be a bit boring because it will be a timeline of all the events, and where I'll try to explain what happened as clearly as possible. But so I hope you please bear with me. We will get to more fun parts in a second. We just need to establish some facts and to understand what is going on. So it begins in March 2022. So as I said, the European connections with Georgia are quite historically established, but Georgia is not a member of the EU. And it applied for it in March 2022. So as you know, applying for European membership is not an easy process. It takes a lot of time because so the so-called accession process, I don't know, I think you're students of international relations, so I'm pretty sure that you have encountered this concept and words at some point during your studies. But basically, the idea is that to become a member of the EU, prospective countries have to respond and have to comply to certain standards. And most of all, they have to comply with the general principles on which the EU is based, which is, as you know, fundamental rights, freedom, democracy, and so on and so forth. So clearly, applying for membership is a lengthy process because of course, the prospective country has to prove that they value the same values that the EU has at its core. And also the EU evaluates each case based on what is the situation, for example, with the democratic institution in the country, what is the situation with the freedom of citizens, all the so-called civil freedom that you can think of: freedom of association, freedom of expression, and so on and so forth. So the process started in March 2022, but then a year after, in March 2023, the ruling party, Georgian Dream, of which you see the logo here, presents the so-called draft laws on transparency of foreign influence and registration of foreign agents. So first of all, Georgian Dream is a nationalist party that is the ruling party in Georgia. It was founded by a billionaire and has very close ties with Russia. So the idea here is that, like many, I mean, I think we've seen this before, and we've seen this in so many countries, not just around Europe, but around the world. This, of course, goes in the direction of so many of the rise of nationalism in so many contexts where there is a skepticism towards international cooperation and also skepticism towards the EU. So in political debates, you often hear that there are like the so-called EU skeptics. So people who are just like parties or political actors that are in principle against the idea of the EU because they see it as an oppression. They see it as an imposition of values that do not necessarily resonate with local contexts. And they also see the whole apparatus of the EU with the bureaucracy, with the regulatory system, and so on and so forth. They see it as quite, as I said, oppressive. And Georgian Dream has been basically has been establishing its reputation as a party precisely with this, by appealing to this sort of anti-EU sentiments in the country. And the idea is that they want to be diplomatically and politically closer to Russia than to the EU. And you might say, wow, well, this is not very smart, considering that just 2 years ago, Russia invaded Ukraine. But I think, and like many observers think, that what the Georgian Dream is trying to do is try to like make good and like be in good in a good position with Russia, hoping to be in a position to sort of like negotiate better instead of basically being under their influence. This is not working very well so far. So basically in 2023, the ruling party presents this draft law called on the transparency of foreign influence. So this law, basically, what does it mean? It means that it is a proposal to make sure that all the institutions, all the NGO organizations that work on Georgian territory are and that receive fundings from foreign, any form of foreign fundings for at least 20% of their for their they're funded for at least 20% for the work that they do on Georgian territory by foreign agents. They have to register themselves with the Georgian authorities, and this is a means for the Georgian authorities to control the amount of foreign fundings that come to Georgia. So the idea here is that it's twofold. So first of all, this type of foreign influence laws are very, very similar one was adopted by Russia in 2012. So the idea is really to basically control this very vulnerable sector, which is NGO or media outlets that might work with foreign fundings. In most cases, this either media outlets or NGOs, they work specifically on the things and on topics that will basically get Georgia closer to EU membership, so fundamental rights, democracy, participatory democracy, freedom of expression, and so on and so forth. So here you start to see the conflicts, right? So on the one hand, Georgia wants to apply for EU membership to be a full-fledged member of the EU, so not anymore a frontier country, but a proper EU country. To do that, they have to comply to certain ideas, certain values of freedom of expressions. They have to have a democratic system that really works, that is not corrupted, and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, this is the requirement to join the EU. On the other hand, you have the nationalist party Georgian Dream, who's like, well, actually, let's just control this by adopting this law that actually allows us to control and then eventually limit the power of all the organizations in the country that are devoted specifically to the promotion of these European values. So in 2023, then these laws were withdrawn from the Georgian parliament. So apparently it for a moment, it felt like they were not going to pass. In December 2023, so the EU grants Georgia candidate status, which means that the EU grants Georgia consider Georgia as a candidate while all the accession procedure continues, and the EU evaluates whether Georgia is fit enough to join the EU based on the stability of its democratic institutions. And then basically a year after, in April 2024, and this is where our story starts, a new draft was proposed by Georgian Dreams, which was slightly reframed. It was not anymore a transparency of foreign influence or registration of foreign agents, but the new wording of the draft law was organizations, a law on the organization pursuing the interests of a foreign power. So you see here the semantic shift is quite significant because here in this in the April 2024 draft, it shows that basically Georgia, so Georgian Dream really has the interest of the nation at heart. And so the idea that limiting the scope and the power that organizations pursuing the interests of a foreign party means that actually Georgian Dream is portraying themselves as the party that really wants the best for Georgia. And we will come back to this on the idea of national interest and how it is exploited against international law. So basically, the law is adopted on the 14th of May 2024. Protests ensue. There suddenly people take the streets, citizens, students. This is, I think, this year has been. We have seen many such protests in many countries and in many contexts and for many reasons. So it was Georgia, it was also Gaza, student encampments in the university. I'm sure, I mean, I don't know if any of you participated into those, but I'm sure you've seen them around Bologna too. And the story sadly always goes, I mean, it always ends in the same way. So there is specific protests and there's always cases of disproportionate use of force by the police. And of course, investigations are now going on, but obviously, I mean, we've talked about this. I think this has been a huge topic, as I said, this year in many contexts. But by the time when the police basically attacks on students, you can have a sense of how fragile the democratic institutions and our idea of freedom is. So just incidentally here, I just wanted to say that the Venice Commission, which is an advisory board that basically works specifically on the interaction between law and democracy, published an opinion on the 21st of May 2024, where it analyzed the impact of this of this draft laws on foreign agents, and declared that they could be potentially disruptive of the process of EU membership for Georgia. So basically, sorry, I made a mistake here. Okay, so basically what happens afterwards is that, so here we're at the end of May, right? In June, what happens at the same time is that Georgia not only is going through this massive civil protests, but is joining for the very first time the Euro 24 championship. So it's a big moment for the whole country. Everybody's excited, and you see somehow how civil protests against the law on foreign agents conflate with the enthusiasm of finally being able to join, if not the EU, at least the European Championship. And I mean, I'm sure this is something you have talked about extensively, but like the idea of how football can and football competitions can really help in fostering this sense of nationality. I mean, it can go both ways, right? It can be exploited by fascist governments, but it can also be helpful in defining the identity of a country that's so hard, that is trying so hard to define itself as a European country indeed. So right after, when the championship starts, you were and while and in the meantime all the protests are going on, many football players from Georgia national team speak up in favor of what's going on in the streets. So they also fear that the law on foreign agents will basically make Georgia more vulnerable to Russia, if not quite similar to Russia in the way it deals with, it kind of limits freedom of expression in the country. And also that basically this law and this government is actually limiting the European future of Georgia. So you have many different reactions. So starting from Yaba Kankava, who's not quite diplomatic, as you can see here, to other football players from the national team, including our very own Serie A Kvicha Kvaratskhelia, who quite suddenly and immediately on his social media supports the protests, the anti-government protests in Georgia, or Georgi Mamardashvili, who's a goalkeeper in Valencia, also in favor of Georgia's path to Europe. They write, "The European way unites us, forward to Europe, peace to Georgia." So quite suddenly, many observers in the public debate started to realize that this weird convergence of, I mean, sometimes it's just chance, no? Like basically this law was passed in this precise period, the protests start, and then the Euro 24 competition starts. So it's a weird mix of course, chance and also not chance, fate, whatever you want to call it. But many observers already start to notice that, and you can see here on the left, this researcher, Georgi Bilanishvili, that basically he says that football success has solidified Georgian society argument. So the idea that as I was saying before, international football competition help nations to solidify their national identity, and the desire to join the EU. And here on the right, you also see another quote that Georgia has a new member and a new band of national heroes, as you could see above from the quotes from the football players, far more popular than any politician. Those players have much greater influence than any other politician. So basically what happens here is that you have a case of football basically being politics by other means, which is nothing new. But I think what is interesting is the way in which this football players do it, specifically in Georgia, and we will talk more about this in a second. Here, just I wanted to show you the I'm sure you remember, but if you don't, I just wanted to show you the game fixtures for Georgia in the Euro 24 competition. Quite interesting. So I think the most epic game was the last one on the 26th of June, where Georgia played against Portugal and won against Portugal. Kvaratskhelia basically living the dream of finally playing against his idol Cristiano Ronaldo. Which in this game basically brought Georgia to the round of 16, where sadly they were defeated by Spain. But still, while all of this was happening, protests in the country was still going on. So we had an interesting case of protests and protesters and football fans basically sometimes being the same person and like both protesting and both advocating for the European future of Georgia. So what happens afterwards? So of course the Euro 2024 competition was over in July. Spain won it, so Georgia did not get very far. It did get very far, to be honest, considering it was the first time they joined, but sadly they did not win. It would have been amazing if they won, but maybe that's for another time. After that, so at the end of June, the EU Council publishes a statement that again says that the law on foreign agents basically, first of all, runs counter European principles. And because of that, so as I said, to be compliant with EU principles is an essential step in the process of accession, so in the process of becoming a new EU member. And so basically this law de facto halts Georgia's accession process. So basically after the summer, what happens was things escalated again because there were Georgian parliamentary elections on 26th of October 2024, and Georgian Dream wins by 54%. So results were contested immediately. Many observers, many political actors, civil society members, they noted already that the elections were not conducted fairly. This also due to an electoral law that has been changed quite abruptly and without so much consultation in May 2024, one might say very conveniently. And this basically sparked a second round of protests, this time in the fall, and this time still going on at this time while we speak, against Georgian Dream and against the elections. So in the meantime, so after the elections, the European Commission published Georgia 2024 report. I'm happy to share all these documents. You can find them online. I can share the PowerPoint at the end of the class, no problem. Basically, what the European Commission notes in this case is what I was briefly mentioning before, that basically the election code. So the main idea of the report is to see how far did Georgia go in the process of complying with the EU standards that would grant her admission. And the answer, sadly, is not very far, or not as far as it should be. And one of the problems and one of the reasons why it didn't go very far is precisely because of the vulnerability of its democratic institution, partly because of the electoral framework. So the Commission said that the electoral framework, as you can read here, is largely in line with relevant international standards, but presents a number of shortcomings. So, for example, as I said, this election code was amended in March and May 2024 with limited consultation. Again, this is very convenient, if you have elections after 5 months. And below, you can see in the part I highlighted in yellow, the reported weaknesses include the recent legislative amendments to the election process, frequent compromises on vote secrecy, procedural inconsistencies, intimidation and pressures on voters that negatively impacted public trust in the process. Sorry, as I said. So situation is still quite complicated and it's still updating as we speak. So again, I will share this, but this is an interesting website that you can consult if you're interested in knowing more. And it covers specifically not just the protests, but it's, as you can see from the title, Civil Georgia, obviously the process of and all the claims of being made by protesters and several political actors that are trying to stand up against Georgian Dream and all the limitation it's basically introducing in the country. So you have a live blog of resistance, chronicle of repression. It's a very good website if you're interested. So the most recent news is that basically, I think just only a few days ago, so Georgia hits brakes on EU accession bids. So the process of the EU membership for Georgia is now has been suspended. and it's been suspended at least until 2028. And what the Georgian Dream representatives say is that this is because they don't want to feel pressured by, and they don't want to be coerced by the EU institution of complying to whatever values they deem appropriate for the Georgian population, and that actually it is the EU who is devoid of European values, and instead Georgia is truly European. So again, this idea that I mentioned before, that basically the one common critique to the EU is an institutional critique, so that the bureaucracy and the institution of the EU are fundamentally incapable of representing the true European values. And this specific political claim has been exploited like crazy by so many nationalist parties all over Europe. So it's quite common. I think I don't have to spend more time talking about this. I just want to point out that it's a very, I mean, you know how the story goes. It's a very common and very well-known argument at this point. Just also a few weeks ago, Kvaratskhelia spoke up again following the new round of protests after the election. And again, he stressed again the idea and the desire and will of the Georgian people to walk and move along the European path. This is our historical choice, the only right choice, and it is unacceptable to deviate from his past. The country belongs to the people, and no one is above the will of the people. Also interesting take on the electoral process. My country hurts, my people hurt. It is painful and emotional to watch the videos that are being circulated. Stop the violence and aggression. Georgia deserves Europe today more than ever. Which I think is also interesting because also speaking of sometimes Kvaratskhelia is equated to Maradona for, of course, his football skills, but sometimes when you speak to people of older generation, mostly fan of Maradona, they say that he was not just a great footballer, but also that he had this sort of great political conscience. And so here we can see how Kvara is actually sort of following the steps of Maradona, not just for his football acumen, but also for his political, in terms of political exposure. Other two interesting figures here, both from Georgian Dream Party and both connected to football, are Kaka Kaladze and Mikhail Kavelashvili. So Kaka Kaladze was actually in Milan for 10 years and is now Secretary General of Georgian Dream. So it's quite a prominent figure. We'll talk more about him, but also just wanted to say that so the political aspect of football, not just present in the resistance, so in the pro-Euro faction of the debate, but it's so football is quite important also in the ruling party, Georgian Dream, and plays a very interesting role. We'll come back to that in a second. The other figure that you might have heard about in the past few days is Mikhail Kavelashvili, played in Manchester City and is about to become the next president of Georgia. So I think elections will be elections, air quotes, because it's not going to be like a popular election, but the parliament and a few members of regional institutions will elect the president, but so far he's the only candidate. So it will more likely Georgia will have an ex-football player as a new president. So all of this, I hope this was clear enough, but I wanted to introduce all these facts to explore two questions that I think are important to the topic of this class. So the first question is one of sovereign prerogatives. So can foreign policy determine the identity of a state, for better or for worse? So what we have seen and I've tried to explain so far is this idea that there is a conflict between national identity and international values. And you can see how this conflict is, whether real or imagined, plays a huge part in political debate, especially in Georgia and especially in the imaginary of Georgia's ruling party. The second question that I think is important to consider is, what do we mean when we look at Europe? So when Georgia pro-Europe resistance wants to portray itself as European, what do we really mean? And when we do that, so how does football contribute to the construction of the idea of Europe? So first question, the question of whether the state identity, sovereign identity, can be influenced by foreign powers is it's almost classical. So basically, if you've ever studied, I'm sure you've taken classes in at least international relations, if not international law. But basically, the classic idea is that on the one hand, you have the state has sovereign prerogatives to decide what's best for themselves and for their citizens. And on the other hand, you have international law, which is sort of like this almost abstract core of norms that state maybe they comply to international law or not, depending on whether it is in their interest. So this is the so-called doctrine of the reason of state. That is that, of course, like history, the history of reason of state is way more nuanced than this, but this is what our perception of it as we speak. So the idea that if a state considers that it's in its interest not to not to comply to international law, because it is better to comply to national law and disregard completely all laws, all international laws, for the security and the safety of the state. I mean, just think of Israel, right? This is what a state is allowed to do. It's in its sovereign prerogatives, it's in its right to defend itself, and its right to defend the state and the security of the state and the citizens. So this is one idea, right? So you have state versus international law. But another option, so another, let's say, more cooperative view, is that actually the state is the one that makes international law. So you have to look at sovereignty and state prerogatives together with international relations. So the both of them are not just connected because, of course, we live in a global world, but because the same states that make domestic laws are the same states that make international law. So this, as you can see, are two opposite ways of thinking about sovereignty and of thinking about the international. But when I said, can foreign policy influence the identity of a nation? The answer is yes. So, for example, in the Italian constitution and in many European constitutions, respect of international and EU law is seen as part of the constitution. So it's so important, as the principles of international law and European law are so important that are often included in the constitution. So here you have a relationship of cooperation between the two. And the same happens with Article 78 of the Georgian Constitution, where there is an obligation that it says that the country has an obligation to pursue Euro-Atlantic aspirations. So, as you can see, you could also easily say that by this article of the Georgian Constitution, the law on foreign agents promoted by Georgian Dream is unconstitutional, basically, because if the European aspirations are to be pursued through freedom of participation, stability of democratic institution, freedom of expression, freedom of association, and you, Georgian Dream, want to introduce a law that limits all this freedom, then obviously you're not complying with Article 78 of the Georgian Constitution. Another example that we can talk about it later if you have questions, but I just wanted to mention this in this context because I think it's quite relevant. Again, this idea that the state, the constitution of the state and the identity of the state and the principles of the state are not just defined by the values of the state itself, but also by the values of, for example, international law, EU law, or also another country. This is an example that, I mean, here in Germany, of course, it's been the prominent debate for the past 14 months after the war on Gaza. But basically, what Germans call the doctrine of Staatsräson, which is basically the translation of reason of state. But what it means is that basically in the German, it's part of the German constitutional values to promote, to defend Israel's rights to exist. And this is considered not to be just a question of diplomacy and mutual cooperation, but it's considered to be integral to German identity and to the German constitution. So again, you see all these examples where the constitution is not just something that states decide, just sitting somewhere on a table, but constitutions are also global instruments where states can actually include foreign and international values within the constitution. Of course, I mean, this is not relevant here, but it is, of course, relevant in the general state of things. Also, when we think about how to exploit all these different arguments and how to manipulate them, but obviously you can see the ramification of this doctrine, no? And the idea that basically all German institutions quite vocally support Israel. And what it means, of course, for an European state to do that. So just because it is considered to be a part of the constitution, right? Again, we can come back on this if you want to know more, but I just wanted to give you another example. So despite the state being still at the center of the structure of football and international relations, this year we have seen new fields of contestation. So you've seen protests in cities, so urban protests in cities as really important hubs where new ideas and resistance also happens, urban resistance. Football games, you have seen the case of the Euro 24 competition, university campuses, as I mentioned before. And what all of these new fields of contestation share is that citizens, students, and football heroes are defending the state against the state itself. So we're in a situation now, and like the Georgian example shows it quite clearly, in which the state is not capable of defending its own values. And this role of defending the state's define the state's most important value and constitution are basically in the hands of people that do not have political agency. So people that are not elected. So citizens, students, and football heroes, which is great. I mean, it's of course in terms of mobilization, visibility, it's great. Remember that quote from before where it said that football players are way more influential than politicians. Yes, but also we will see the shortcomings of this. But definitely there's a way in which football is promoting participatory democracy in Georgia in at least two ways. So here, again, I can share this article if you want, but basically I found it very useful because it discusses how the idea of Europe can be basically pursued through football, which is exactly what I think Georgia is doing. And why is that? Because first of all, there's an emotional dimension coupled with a regulatory aspect. So the idea here is to see football as a European phenomenon means that, of course, there is an emotional dimension to this. It means that the Georgian people wants to see themselves as European, and they do that, first of all, by joining the European competition for the first time, but also by thinking about Europe and by thinking about the laws that they want or they do not want in their country so that they can join finally the EU and be subject of to the European law and regulatory system. The second aspect that I find really interesting is that football allows this process of that many scholars such as Weber in 2021, but also Kram in 2001 described as the banal Europeanization. So what is banal Europeanization? So processes of Europeanization or nationalization are not always this dramatic. So there's not always a protest, there's not always like a moment of conflict that defines a nation, like a revolution or whatever. And likewise, the same happens with the idea of Europe. So you don't have maybe a defining moment that defines Europe. So that you don't have a revolution, you don't have like a moment where, I don't know, people take the streets to say, we really want Europe, we want this. In this case, actually, Georgia is quite unique because you barely have that in Europe. Nobody's claiming for more Europe in Europe. And we'll come back to this at the end. But there's also another more banal aspect of Europeanization that actually happens on a day-to-day. So it's the streets we walk in, the TV that is playing a game, a football game, I don't know, going to a bar to watch another football game with friends, and like the way in which football seeps into our daily life that of course really really help the process of Europeanization. Two things are important here. So the question of transnational competitions, as we said, Georgia going through this massive protest and joining the Euro 24 for the first time was really, really huge, and clearly a part of, I think this is an interesting way, it's a useful way of reading this process of banal Europeanization. And second, the mobility of players. Of course, as I will say in a second, the fact that Kvaratskhelia plays in Serie A has somehow like brought more attention, not just to him in Georgia because he plays in Serie A, but also to us because we probably, apart from Kaladze, we would not have heard about Georgia so much with so much enthusiasm if it wasn't for Kvaratskhelia. So it works both ways. And again, this process of internalization and inhabitation. So just saying that basically football has this way of really seeping into the conscience of people in a very banal, but in a very simple way that it's very effective. It's very, it affects everybody's daily life, basically. And this is how the idea of Europe comes through. Last point, so basically through the spatial and temporal dimension of football. And basically the authors of this article, De Witte and Zielinski, they claim that basically doing Europe through football is a way of doing Europe without threatening the local. Although we have seen that in the case of Georgia, this is not exactly true. I will skip this because probably I'm running out of time. But this is a movie that I would really recommend you seeing. And that is connected with what I want to say next, that basically another way of thinking about Europeanization in the case of Kvaratskhelia is the case of Europeanization by association. So in this movie, basically, it's from a Georgian director. It's called What Do We See When We Look at the Sky? And it's a love story. It's amazing. I really recommend you see it. But at some point in the movie, the reason why I'm mentioning it is that at some point, halfway through the movie, there's a scene where children are playing in a football field in a city in Georgia named Kutaisi. And basically the song Notti Magiche comes up, which you probably, I don't know if you remember, but it's from Italy in 1990 World Cup. It was of course the hymn of the competition. And when I watched it, I was like, okay, so why is this song in Italian in a Georgian movie? And the reason for this, I think, is because this idea of Europeanization sometimes doesn't have to be that abstract. So it's, on the one hand, yes, it's through football's appeal to everyday life. On the other hand, it's through actually protests, through active engagement with ideas of Europe and appropriations of idea of Europe. But sometimes it also happens through this idea, like Europeanization, I called it here by association. So here, again, so the mobility of players is a huge aspect of the transnational and global dimension of football. But what it means actually is that you have players such as Kvaratskhelia that experience and make football fans experience what some scholars called cognitive migration. So you don't actually have to migrate to Georgia to understand all of this, but the fact that you have a Georgian player in your team makes you closer, like makes you mentally closer to the instances of that country. And of course, this goes both ways. So you have Georgia in Napoli and Napoli in Georgia. You have different phenomena of appropriation of and of the idea of Europe through the mediation of Italy. So Quara goes by many nicknames, but one famous one is Caravaggio, which of course it's a famous Italian painter. So there's this system of, we would say, transnational solidarity and diplomacy that goes that is at stake here, and this goes specifically by basically Quara asserting his proud membership to proud citizenship to the Georgian state on the one hand, but also his credentials, his European credentials, are somehow taken more seriously because he plays in Serie A. And so he's able to take Georgia to Europe through Italy because he's part of a good European domestic league. Another example, so I mentioned before those two people, so Kakakaladze and Kalevashvili, so potentially the next president of Georgia. So another way in which it is possible to do Europe through football is by nationalism, sadly, but this is also part of the story. So Kakakaladze, so I forgot to say, he's so he used to play in Milan for 10 years. He is the Secretary General of Georgian Dream, and he's also the mayor of Tbilisi, which is the Georgian capital. And in an interview that he released to La Repubblica in June 2024, he actually says that he was happy that he played in Serie A for so long, because playing in Serie A made him a true leader and made him a man. And so he vindicates the Serie A heritage to establish his leadership credentials in Georgia. So again, this idea of exploiting Serie A, exploiting the Italian league as a European league, as a way to establish his credential and his reputation in his home country. Another example is, so the founder of Georgian Dream is Bidzina Ivanishvili, who donated $10 million to the Georgian national team after the first win against Portugal. And Kalevashvili, who probably on Sunday will become the next president. I don't know. We'll see. It's quite likely. But here you see again the idea of bringing Europe to Georgia through Italy, but this time to establish an anti-EU stance. So basically what Kaladze is trying to say, look, I played in Serie A, so I'm a true leader. I'm a true European leader. I don't need the EU. I'm all right. I'm quite a European as I am. And that's it. So here you have I will move quickly on this. We can maybe discuss this later. Different strategies and infrastructures that can contribute to the Europeanization of football, especially in Georgia. So as you can see, this is a page from the Euro 2024 competition, where you can see that there are many documents online saying that basically there's a strategic idea to develop Georgian football as a crucial sector for the country and for the country's identity. Another example is of resistance through football and through education is Torpedo Kutaisi, which is a football club from the city of Kutaisi, which is owned entirely by the New Vision University, which is a university it's a pro-European university that promotes ideas of civic engagement and Europeanization through football, through education, through civic engagement. So again, you have football is strategic both for the nationalists and for the resistance. So it's really a field of contestation here. Another example is the Inter Academy in Georgia. So Inter has many football academies in the world, but the one in Georgia has been renewed, I think, for another 5 years because of its success. And again, so Inter here partnered with New Vision University to create this academy. And again, the idea is to foster, again, you see how Serie A and how Italy is really strategic in this process of like Europeanization through a member, an Italian, a state that is already a member of the EU and that is helping bringing Georgia closer to Europe strategically. And here you see also very recently, so last January, the the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs introduced sport as sport diplomacy actually as a new instrument of strategic promotion of Italy abroad. So all these activities are part of a strategic plan that not only comes from Georgia, but is also an important part of the strategic promotion of Italy abroad. Some concluding remarks. So we have seen how so football can be exploited by nationalists. This we know. It's part of also football heritage that it's been so, and also the way in which it is built and the way it works as an institution and also as a hierarchical institution. But football also has a huge emancipatory potential that is being used and mobilized by many resistance movements around the world. I'm also thinking of Palestine here. There's a lot of movement going on in this field that I think is really, really important. At the same time, as we said, football is a transnational phenomenon. So you have football as an aspect, as a phenomenon of local resistance, but also local resistance has to comes to term with the limits that are basically given by football to football by the fact that it is an international phenomenon, and being an international phenomenon, it shares with international law and international relations the same problems and the same limits and the same grammar of the state. So the emancipatory potential sometimes has a limit in the way in which it can develop and in the way in which it can be brought forward, because the structure and the hierarchy of football is still quite state-centric, and it kind of resembles that of international law. At the same time, I also wanted to remind you we will always have, I mean, for the time being, we are surrounded by people who think that states decide what they want to do in spite of international law, because states know better, and it is a sovereign prerogative to decide what the state wants, despite what international law says. But just as a reminder, whenever you hear somebody saying that, it is also important to remember that international law does not exist in a void. International law is made by states. So whenever, I don't know, you're in a dinner party and you want to challenge someone who's being a nationalist, saying that states don't need to respect international law, you can remind them that states are international law. There's also a question of qualitative versus quantitative democracy. So as I said, all these new actors, all these new fields of contestation, cities, football games, students, student encampments. The question is, protests are great. They're voicing a cry for justice that has been long dormant and that a lot of people want. And it's really shifting also the public debate, which I think is great. But there's also always, sadly, because of the limits of the state in which our societies are formed, there's also the question of it's not just about it's not just the protest, but it's also the question is those who protest do not necessarily then have the power to promote the democracy if the electoral system, for example, is not working as it should. So here, football can promote democracy, but it lacks institutional accountability, which is a huge problem always with football institutions. However, as we've seen, its symbolic and infrastructural value is unmatched because it has this power of promoting Europeanization through internalizations of this value in a way almost naturally without that people even notice, no? So it's not an imposition of EU standards, but it's somehow it's almost second nature somehow. And I want us to end here with a small caveat, because of course, when a country is struggling to portray themselves as European and they want to not just become a member of the EU like Georgia, but they want to join the idea of Europe, this is great. And of course, as Europeans, we should all be proud. But sometimes I think it is also important to remember and to zoom out a little, because European debates on football are so Eurocentric most of the time, because the assumption is that, of course, European football, because football is European, is inherently European, and this is what we offer. So it's one of the values that we offer, but it's actually not true. So it's important to remember that, of course, yes, a specific way of doing football was born in Europe, but this doesn't mean that football is a distinctively European phenomenon. So the other way, so it works in one way. So football is a big part of European identity. That's true. But football is not necessarily just European. And I think this is important because, especially when we talk about migration and borders and football players, I don't know, coming from African countries, most of the time we fall victim to this idea, that this Eurocentric idea that football, European football is the best. Of course, it's desirable for many players still, but I think we should be careful not to imply that only European football is the good one. Only European football has the right to exist and it's legitimate, because actually, when you look at the history of football, it's a complicated history. It shares many ties with colonialism and practices of civilization. But at the same time, again, the emancipatory power of football and the resistance that football allows is present in the history of football as well. And just this article that I found, it's really, really interesting. I really recommend it to you. And it shows how basically, yes, for example, in colonial Zanzibar, Europeans, so English introduced football, true. But then actually it became something that completely independent from whatever the English thought football was, and became like a true expression of the local people and the local communities. So this is just a caveat, just to say that there's Europe from within and Europe from without. So when we think about the European values and what brings us together, and prospective countries wanting to join Europe, great. But let's not universalize it and think that Europe has this great values that, I mean, they're crumbling before our eyes, obviously. And let's also not universalize the European dimension of football as the only possible one, because it is not true. Football exists everywhere. And yeah, I'll leave it here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Francesca. If you can just skip on the final remarks 1 second, that I want to add. Yeah, because I thank you for this enlightening presentation. I just wanted to mention 2 elements that are a little bit peripheral from your for your presentation, but that help us to discuss something that we will discuss in the next lessons. Speaking about lack of institutional accountability, yesterday FIFA has decided the final destination of the 2030-2034 FIFA Male World Cup, and we will discuss exactly this lack of transparency in the process of in the bidding process, but has nothing to do with today's lesson. And speaking about the caveat is exactly what we have discussed, speaking about the concept of indigenization that we have presented in the first in the first lesson. So having said that, thank you very much, Francesca. I have several questions, but before asking my question, as always, I leave the floor for the student, and I ask if they have a specific question or some reflection or some ideas coming after this presentation. So who wants to start?
I will end the presentation, okay?
So, let's see if you can listen. Okay, try.
I wanted to ask if
can you listen?
I can.
Okay,
I cannot see you, but I can. If you move, can you move to the left a little?
No, I move the camera.
Sounds good. Okay, thank you.
I wanted to ask you if you could talk us more about the German Stadtrazon, because I find it quite interesting as a topic.
Of course. Yeah. So obviously, I mean, I'm in Germany, and it's. I mean, I'm glad you asked about this, because it's. I think it's something that in Italy it's not being this. I mean, sometimes you find articles where people are like, oh my god, what is this? But it's not really part of the public debate as it is here. So basically, apparently, so this doctrine of the Staatsräson is, so Angela Merkel was the main proponent of this, which is also interesting. I think it was a speech she had in 2008, where basically she connected the right of Israel to exist to the very core of German identity. Of course, this is for historical reasons, right? So post World War II, basically the idea that Germany would be reconstructed, and in the process of reconstruction would also support the new state of Israel, which was also built in 1948. So basically what is going on here on this is that because of this Staatsräson principle, there have been many limitations to freedom of expressions in the German public debate. Also, I mean, again, it's been a year of protests, right, all around the world. But I think, especially external observers, and also myself, I had no idea this would be so serious before I moved here. But basically, because of this sense of shared history, and the idea that Germany has to defend and has to make up for the guilt of the Holocaust, what is going on is that basically there's a huge system of repression that goes, I mean, it works in many ways. So it works in like people protesting in the streets, being attacked by the police. There's also progressive Jewish voices who are being completely unheard in this process of like the German state claiming what the German state is, and being German means that you have to support Israel. There's also the question that new citizens are asked to also pledge allegiance to the state of new German citizens, so citizens that apply for German citizenship, are also asked to pledge allegiance to the state of Israel. Again, as part of this sort of weird combination of things that is part of, again, German constitutional identity. And just recently, like last month, there was, so the Parliament passed a so-called Antisemitismus Resolution, which is basically a bill that it's not binding. That's the good news, but it's still sort of non-binding legal document that is providing some guidelines to protect Jewish life in the country. And what that means is that research institution and also art foundations will be subject to more scrutiny based on the activities that they do. So if some of the activities are patently pro-Palestine, or they will be probably some funds will be cut. Let's just say that. I don't know if this will actually be implemented and to what extent really this will happen, because as I said, it's not binding. But like there's a sense that is quite disheartening that even if these legal instruments are not binding, the German society is quite united on this, and it's quite disheartening coming from, I mean, it's not any better in Italy, right? So our state also supports Israel, but I don't feel, as an Italian, I don't feel this sense of, I don't feel that my identity is connected with the identity of Israel as many German citizens do. And my sense is that things are getting a bit better, like in the last, sorry, I have a sensor here that, okay. Things are getting a bit better because there have been many attempts to discredit this idea of Staatsräson, and that is actually not protecting Jewish life at all, is actually endangering it, and not giving voice to Jewish who might think otherwise, because being Jewish doesn't mean that you're an anti-Semite, right? That you're pro-Israel, right? So my sense is that this is changing a bit. So when I was here at the beginning of the year, it was really, really, it felt like really, there was this sense really of repression, like cultural repression even. Now I think some attempts at sort of like discrediting this theory are moving forward and are being successful. So I'm feeling a bit more hopeful, but this sense of German guilt, it's just really, really hard to break in a way. The sense also of like uniqueness of the German state and the German experience that sorry, I got a notification. Maybe somebody knows I'm talking about this, but it's fine. No, I'm joking. It's really hard to shake, no? This basically huge sense of historical uniqueness, so that what Germany went through and what Germany did is just really unique, and there's nothing, so there's no comparison to be made. So it's just, this is also something that, yeah, I find quite, it's really hard for me to navigate, because also as a historian, like we compare stuff, like we compare events with other events. But apparently that's not something that the standard German doctrine allows. So yeah, thank you for asking this. You gave me the chance to probably share something that is not much known in Italy.
Another question? Yes.
I'm from post-USSR country, so that's why I'm really into what's happening in Germany, Georgia. So I know that the protests start because of the Russian law about foreign agents, and I want to know your opinion. Will Russia allow Georgia to take a European and Western pass? Because I know there before was a president, Saakashvili, who really did a lot to Georgia and was really close to Western culture, but now we can see he's almost dying in prison. So will Russia in the end allow Georgia to take the Western pass?
El Nuresh is from Kazakhstan. So
yeah, okay, great. Oh, one of my best friends is from Kazakhstan, so I'm no, thank you so much for this question. I mean, at the end, we can talk about this, we can think about different theories and different ideas at stake, but in the end, like, you're right, like the question of geopolitics and spheres of influence, it's at the end of the day still what decides most national questions. So again, the idea that states don't decide. I mean, they decide stuff for themselves, but they're pretty much entrenched in international politics. I think, I mean, from the way things are looking, I don't think it's happening. So I think that Russia will favorably have Georgia within its, states under the influence that can, I hope, I mean, I think after our Italian government, I think every hope in nationalist governments is misplaced. But when Georgian Dream says that they want to cultivate a relationship with Russia that is more equal, that allows them to probably not be subject to invasion, although 20% of Georgian territory is still controlled by Russia. I mean, I don't know. Will the question is, I think this is where it's going. Unless, I don't know, something happens, but this is clearly like with the, also we'll see on Sunday, no, with the new presidents, but until, I mean, if elections are not recalled, we're looking at Georgia not being in Europe for at least the time in which Georgian Dream will be ruling. And this, of course, is quite favorable for Russia at the moment, because, I mean, also, I don't have to tell you, but a big part of the debate on the Ukrainian invasion was also about Ukraine's accession to NATO, no? So like all these things, like it's not just at the end of the day, you might say it's always just diplomacy, but also it's not, like, because when countries like Georgia or Ukraine want to accede and become member of Euro-Atlantic institutions, then it's all of a sudden it's not just about diplomacy. It's really like it's Russia perceives that as a threat. So I think, yeah, like my only way to reply to your question is that Russia will not allow it. But at this point, I think Georgia will not allow it from the way things are going. I'm just hoping that I don't know how strong they will be politically and how influentially they will be institutionally. But I think the best case scenario at this point is that Georgia like develops a very strong voice, but will it be strong enough to counter Russia? I don't know. You probably have more info and insights on this than I do.
Other questions? If not, I wanted to ask you two things. The first one is about the profile of Kvaratskhelia and how much his football past has influenced his career in a similar way to Kaladze or in a different one. And the second one that is. I don't know if you can answer, but my question is if footballers are seen as part of the civil society, you know, like Kvaratskhelia has been as one of the people, or part of the 1%, because in somehow we have seen in the American elections that superstar sports stars or actors, musicians are of course influential and can have an impact, but at the same time can be seen as part of an elite, and so not necessarily will be able to convince people to vote in the same direction as they would like.
Thank you, Nicola. So the first question on Kvaratskhelia, it's quite interesting. So the news came out, I think, if not last week, a few weeks ago, something like that. And I've been following closely, of course, for this class, but also because at this point, I just find it such an interesting case study, you know, that like the convergence of football and all of this. But I haven't found any, so maybe he hasn't released a statement yet, or I don't know. I haven't found any. I mean, of course, you find all this news about, you know, former Manchester City football player potentially to become new president of Georgia, but I haven't found any specific statement about how his career equipped him to potentially be able to do this job. But I have two possible answers to this. So one, first of all, I think it's important that it's quite relevant that there hasn't been, I mean, there have been many flashy articles about him becoming a president, but there has not been one on playing in the Premier League makes you a proper leader. And I don't know, maybe I'm reading too much into this, but the UK is no longer in the EU, obviously. So strategically, I think it makes more sense for somebody like Kaladze to release an interview to say that, you know, I've been in Serie A, I'm a true leader, and I also believe in Europe and the values of Europe, not the EU values, but European values. Whereas strategically, maybe it doesn't make that much sense for somebody to say, yeah, Premier League, I'm a European. It's not. It's quite controversial, no? That part of the. But that's also interesting. Like my counter question would be, is Premier League now less European now that they're not in the EU? I don't know. But the other question, sorry. The other thing that I found is that basically a few years ago, Kalashvili was one of the names suggested to become the next president of the Georgian Football Association. But then he didn't become president because he doesn't have, for lack of former higher education. Question is, like, can you become a president then? I don't know. The question about footballers being part of society or part of the 1% is so interesting, because my sense is that actually, because also from the scenes of like after the win against Portugal, no, like there were all these celebrations in the street, and also my sense is that it's somewhere in between. Like, I don't think that they're necessarily, I mean, they're not, Kvara is not part of the civil society because he doesn't go and protest, that's for sure. But I don't see him as a 1% either. It looks like it's more of a popular hero than, I don't know, Beyonce supporting Kamala kind of example. So, and I think this is partly because of the way football works, no, and the way in which the time convergence between this specific episode of Georgian history and the Euro Cup. I think that contributed to make Kvara more of a popular hero than a 1% hero. But that's my perception. So we'll see how things develop.
And there is also maybe a generational gap between Kaladze and Kavelashvili one side, and Krava and the other teammates that seems more progressive in somehow in their orientation. Do you think?
Yeah, obviously. Also, I mean, use of social media, just one example, no? Like, I don't think Kalashvili has social media, but Kvara is, I mean, every time something happens, he posts on Instagram, or so it's clearly it has a different, I think it's more, yeah, it reaches out to more people, and the image it projects, I think it's more popular in that sense.
Other questions? Curiosity? Maybe Francesca, outside football, there are some specific case that you think are relevant, or football it's really the national sport in Georgia, so it's the one that catalyzes all the attention.
I don't know. Are you asking specifically about sports or in general about strategies of Europeanization?
No, about sport. If you have seen some similarities in other sports, if there are some other sports politician in somehow, or among the protesters there were some high-ranked sports people, or even against the protest there were some. If you know,
I don't know much about it. I know that there's an article on Politico that I shared on the presentation that said that there were more people, I think, from probably heavy lifting competition or something in the Georgian Dream. So, like, apparently they have more athletes on that side, but on the side of the resistance, I don't know. But yeah, I'll think about it. What I know is that, like, there's many ways of like doing Europeanization, and like, of course, one, and I mentioned that at the beginning, so one is history, and like thinking about the country's history as a way of like feeling European because of showing a track record of European belonging in a way. And I think interestingly, it's not connected to football or sport in general, but one interesting way that Georgia is doing is to sort of advance the European membership claim is they are portraying themselves as the country of wine, so the country in which wine was invented, which it's quite interesting because we all have different ideas and like different imaginaries about how this happened, but they also have like proven archaeological record to this effect, saying that wine production was born in Georgia. And this could be interesting because, of course, I think in Europe, many of us would think that it goes back to Greece, no? And like even this idea, when I was saying at the beginning, mythology, no? When we think about Greek mythology, we just think about Greece, but Greece was so many things, no? Like it also was part of Georgia, no? So the many of the stories that we grew up with as European that are foundational of our mythology actually come from Georgia, as does wine apparently. So that's, I always find this interesting. But again, I think compared to football, wine has the problem that export and import taxes are way more expensive than actually playing in a field with a ball. So it always comes back to football actually being way more accessible than any other form of self-promotion that states can think of, I think.
Okay. Yeah, we have another question. Yes.
I was thinking because if I understood well, Georgia is not coming to Europe because it's actually with the far right. But what about Poland and Hungary? Like,
yeah. So the thing is, the problem with the EU is really hard to get in. To exit is, I mean, we've seen this with Brexit. It's also hard, but doable. But the thing is that the EU cannot kick you out. So when you apply for membership, the EU wants to make sure that you comply with all these values, you know, of European freedom, etc., and so on and so forth. But quite interestingly, they cannot kick you out for not respecting those values, which is so it's such a contradiction, no? Because I mean, we've seen that in Hungary, we've seen that in Poland. It's just not but on the one hand, this is one part of the story, so that you cannot be kicked out even if you disrespect EU values. But at the same time, this, I think, this law and the specific lack of like procedures for, I mean, of course, there are procedures to punish or sanction states that do not behave well according to EU standards. But on the other hand, I think it is quite valuable that there is no, I mean, for the way the EU works, it is valuable that there's no expulsion procedure, because this, at the end of the day, it is to protect citizens. So it's it sucks that states are not punished as they should be for not respecting values that they should be respecting. But at the end of the day, I'm much happier for Polish and Hungarian citizens to benefit from the benefits of being a European citizens than being deprived of them because governments, right? But governments come and go, hopefully. Maybe my hope is misplaced, but I think the idea here, and at least I think the legal rationale behind this is that citizens are always protected, which, I mean, it's debatable, right? But I don't know. I find it reasonable, at least.
Okay, one last question by Francesca, then we have to finish.
Wait, Nicola, can you? Okay.
We've discussed about how international law does not exist in a void, but is made by the states themselves. And I mean, from what we see, it is actually quite difficult to get states to comply with international law unless it benefits them in some way. Otherwise, states' tendency is to trying to preserve their integrity. And I feel like when they do not comply with international law, there aren't really that much repercussions. And my personal feeling is that international law is a lot weaker and ineffective than I thought it was. So I wanted to ask you, what's your opinion about the effectiveness of international law?
Yeah, thank you so much for this. Because I think, we talk and talk, but then it's helpful to also think about does it work? I think, I don't have to say it like this year has been so depressing on many levels. And I have a PhD in international law, and I've always been critical of it, but I think to see how blatantly and how just without even it's normal for states to violate international law. This has been for ages, but I think to test the limits of how much you can violate and get away with it, this year has really been the past 14 months basically since Gaza have been quite depressing and scary, because basically now I think Israel is setting up a precedent and like my fear is that because now we know that a so-called democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East, can violate international law, nobody does anything about it. It's scary because it means that I hope it doesn't, but I'm afraid it means that more states will try and do that because nothing happens anyway, right? So there's that's for sure. But there are two things that I think about when I want to find comfort, and I hope that helps. If there was an existential question also, rather than not only an academic one. So one thing I think is really like the huge impact of protests. Again, so that it's not international institutions that guarantee international law, but students in school. On the one hand, freaks me out because it means like you guys are paid to do that. You're institutionally accountable to do that, and you're not doing your job. Instead, kids are doing your job. So on the one hand, it freaks me out and makes me angry, but on the other, it makes me think that there's as I said, there's several cries of justice in the world at this moment. They're not necessarily coming from international institutions, but they're coming with the language of international law. So however broad and however critical and however biased that language is, it is still the language that we use. So we use the word genocide, we use the word humanitarian laws, we use all these words that are part of the legal language of international law. Another thing that I was comforted by was that, I don't know if you remember, but in last January, when there were the proceedings at the ICJ of South Africa against Israel, and you have a state like South Africa, so that of course has so much history and so much knowledge about what it actually means to have to live under apartheid and under segregation. And so you have a state that does not come from the West, use a language, again, the language of international law, that is full of problems and it's clearly Eurocentric, but you have a state coming from Africa that uses the language and makes it its own to defend something that nobody else is defending, right? So, of course, I share your disappointment and your sense that states don't, but this has always been the case, right? So there's always been, like, international law has always been about more about violations than about respect, sadly. But on the one hand, I see this like shift in power and shifts in languages. And on the other, I also, like, on your question of like international law, like states are really international law. True, like, because of course they can limit the amount of international law they want to apply or disregard it completely. But what I meant is that, like, who is it that does international law? Like, maybe it's individuals. Yes, it's more and more individuals, citizens in the street, students in schools, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, if you have a treaty and you need to adopt it in your domestic legal system, who does that? It's still the state, So what I mean to say is that it's a false, like in many cases, it's a false dichotomy. I don't mean when I mean that states are international law, I don't mean to say that, you know, all states respect international law. That's not what I meant. But I mean that there's much more, like there's an integrally international component to the state as we think of it. That sometimes just, you know, because we're subject to this very poorly reasoned debates from nationalist parties that say that, you know, sovereign prerogative, sovereign state, the state decides whatever. Sometimes we forget that it is also a sovereign prerogative to exercise international law. So this is what I meant. I don't have like false hope about this actually turning into a sweet word where laws are respected. But what I mean, I think it's at least even just rhetorically, it's really helpful to remind these people that it's the same state that they want to defend is the same that does international law, which is something that they forget, because it's like they think it's, you know, two different people, like other people. No, it's exactly the same entity exercising the exact same rights. So yeah, I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. Grazie, Francesca. For you, I see you at 5. So I see you later. So today we have a 4-hour lesson.
Good luck.
So thank you. Even more thank you. So you have allowed to do a little bit different, no? So different voice. They don't listen my voice for too much. Francesca, grazie mille davvero.
Thank you so much.
Poi ti scriverò più tardi per ringraziarti ancora. E se mi mandi poi le slide senza fretta, io poi le metto.
I'm also happy to share materials or my email with the students if they want to reach out.
Ok.
Ok. Ciao Nicola, grazie.
Ciao, grazie mille.
Ciao ciao.